My wife cheated on me at a party. I disappeared without a word, not dramatically. No slammed doors, no shattered glasses, no tearful scene in the hallway. I found them upstairs in the guest bedroom of our own house during a party we had planned together, with food she had chosen and music I had cued. I stood in the doorway for 5 seconds. Neither of them saw me. I pulled the door closed, walked downstairs, finished my drink, shook a few hands, and left. She called 47 times before I stopped counting. The spare key was still on the kitchen counter when I came back for my things. It had always been my house. She just hadn't thought about what that meant. The party had been her idea. A late summer thing, she said. 30-some people. The backyard strung with lights she'd ordered online. A playlist I'd spent an embarrassing amount of time on. I'd taken the afternoon off to move furniture, set up folding tables, carry ice from the garage. By 8 o'clock, I was talking to a neighbor about something I can't remember now, and Sarah was across the yard near the drink table, laughing at something Theo had said. I noticed. I told myself I was being paranoid. Theo and I had been friends for 11 years. We'd met through work. He was a contractor I'd used on a project when I was still freelancing, before the practice became a real business. He was the kind of person who remembered your coffee order and forgot to pay you back for lunch. Charming in a way that requires someone else to absorb the cost. I had been absorbing it for 11 years without doing the math. I went inside to get a jacket I didn't particularly need. I walked upstairs. The guest room door was pushed mostly closed but not latched. I could hear them before I touched it. I don't have a clean account of the 5 seconds after I pushed it open. I remember the bedspread, a green one Sarah had bought at an estate sale and been proud of. I remember that neither of them was looking at the door. I remember pulling it shut with what I thought was a normal amount of force. I walked downstairs. Someone handed me a drink. I don't remember who. I stood in my own kitchen for a few minutes, and then I was outside. And then I was saying goodbye to Carol, Sarah's mother, who had come and was leaving early because of her hip. I thanked her for making the drive. I said Sarah was upstairs freshening up. Carol patted my arm and said the potato salad was wonderful. On the kitchen counter, near the back door, sat a spare key on a plain ring. Sarah had set it out for a friend who was supposed to stop by and never did. I picked it up, looked at it for a second, and put it back down. Then I left my own party. I drove for a while without deciding where I was going and ended up in the parking lot of a shopping center about 4 miles away. I sat there for 2 hours. I'm telling you that now because I spent a long time afterward describing what I did that night in terms that made it sound more composed than it was. I did not drive calmly to my sister's apartment. I drove in circles and eventually stopped moving. Then I called Renata. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what I'd seen. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Are you driving?" "No, parking lot." "Come here," she said. Renata is 6 years older than me and has approximately no patience for sentiment, which is what I needed that night. She made coffee. She didn't ask me to describe it again or tell me how I must be feeling. She sat at her kitchen table and waited until I said, "I need the envelope." She got up immediately, which told me she'd been waiting for that sentence for longer than I'd realized. 6 months earlier, I had gone to see a lawyer, not because I had proof of anything. I had nothing that concrete, just a feeling that had been getting harder to explain away. The lawyer's name was on a referral card a colleague had given me after his own divorce, and I'd held onto it for 2 months before I made the call. The consultation lasted an hour. She walked me through the prenuptial agreement Sarah and I had signed before our wedding, confirmed that the house, purchased in my name 2 years before I met Sarah, remained separate property under our state's laws, and outlined what documentation I'd want to have organized if things progressed. I had written a list. I sealed it in an envelope with the lawyer's card and a note to myself that said, "If this becomes real." I gave it to Renata and told her to hold it. She hadn't asked any questions. That was also what I needed. She slid the envelope across the table now and refilled my coffee. I opened it. The list was in my handwriting. Bank accounts, business and corporation records, the deed, the prenuptial agreement, the lawyer's number, practical things. The kind of list a person writes when they are trying to be prepared rather than paranoid. And the difference between those two things turns out to be very small. I called the lawyer's number and left a voicemail at 11:15 at night. She called back at 7 the next morning. I had an appointment by 9. My phone had been on the table the whole time. I hadn't looked at it. Renata pointed at it once, and I shook my head. Around midnight, I picked it up. Sarah had texted 17 times and called 11 times before switching to texts only. The progression was, "Where are you? Are you okay? Please call me. I'm worried." And then, at 11:42, "Theo told me you saw us. Marcus, please. It wasn't what it looked like." I put the phone face down. It was exactly what it looked like. She knew that. What she meant was that she had an explanation prepared, which she was used to me accepting. I thought about the first time I'd noticed something. It was in February, Theo's name appearing in conversations where it hadn't fit quite right. Sarah's phone consistently face down on the counter, a weekend she'd spent with friends I'd never been able to picture clearly. I had noticed all of it. I had chosen each time to file it without acting. Looking would make it real. I was not ready for it to be real. That night in Renata's kitchen, I understood that I had been choosing not to look for months, and that choice had cost me something I wasn't finished calculating. I also understood that I could spend the next several years explaining that cost to Sarah, laying out evidence, asking for accountability, waiting for remorse, and she would meet every attempt with something that sounded like an answer without being one. I knew because I had watched her do it before. Smaller things, different scales. The mechanics were familiar. I stayed at Renata's. I slept badly. In the morning, I drank her terrible coffee and went to meet the lawyer. The furnished apartment I rented the morning after the party was on the 4th floor of a building, 12 minutes from my office. It had a bed, a couch, a small table, and a kitchen that smelled faintly of someone else's cooking. I brought my laptop, my work files, a bag of clothes I packed in 20 minutes while Sarah was still at Carol's, and a coffee maker I'd bought on the way there. I set the coffee maker on the counter and stood in the middle of the room for a minute, taking inventory of what I had created. Then I opened my laptop and got on a client call. The call was about a network infrastructure upgrade for a company that had been with me for 4 years. I talked through the proposal for 40 minutes. I answered follow-up questions. When it ended, Priya sent me a message that just said, "Good call," and I thought, fine. The work is fine. The work has always been fine. Priya had been my business partner for 3 years. She handled client relationships and business development, while I handled architecture and technical delivery. She'd noticed something was wrong about 6 weeks before the party, not because I'd told her anything, but because she tracked our billing schedule carefully and could see when I was distracted. She'd asked once, I'd said personal stuff, and she had respected that in the specific way that means I know, but I'm not pushing. The morning after the party, I called her and told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you need me to cover anything this week?" "No," I said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," she said. "Cover anything this week?" "Maybe Tuesday." The business had been built entirely by me. Incorporated before the marriage, Sarah's name on none of the filings, no equity shared, no role held. This was not a strategic decision I'd made in anticipation of anything. It was simply that the business existed before Sarah did, in terms of my adult life, and that structure had never changed. I had never thought of this as protection. It became protection anyway. I moved what needed moving financially. The joint account had both our contributions recorded clearly. My lawyer advised me not to take anything beyond what I'd deposited. I didn't. I opened a sole account, transferred my portion, and left Sarah's intact. I documented everything with the precision of someone who knows they may need to explain it later to a person who has the authority to care. I changed the Wi-Fi password at the house and the garage code. My lawyer advised against changing the locks until the separation was formalized, so I didn't change the locks. I followed her advice exactly and resisted the urge to do things that felt satisfying but would complicate the process. About 10 days after the party, I went to the house to collect mail. Sarah was staying with Carol. I'd timed it that way. My neighbor Joel was outside when I pulled up. We weren't close, the kind of neighbors who wave and occasionally discuss local road construction. But he walked over when he saw me. He said he'd heard I might be moving and wanted to check in. Then, in the way that people say things they assume you already know, he mentioned Theo's car. "I figured you had some kind of project going," Joel said. "A contractor thing. But it was pretty regular. 3-4 months at least, sometimes twice a week." I thanked him. I said I appreciated him mentioning it. I collected my mail, got in my car, and sat in the driveway for a while. 4 months, minimum, twice a week sometimes. I had been at work. I had been billing clients, managing projects, building the thing that paid for the house where this was happening twice a week. There is a particular kind of cold that comes from doing that math, and it is not the dramatic flash of rage kind. It is slower. It changes the texture of every memory it touches. I filed that information with the lawyer. Carol called me 11 days after the party. She opened with my name in the tone of someone carrying a message they didn't write. Sarah had asked her to try. "She knows she hurt you," Carol said. "She wants you to know that it's over, that it was a mistake, and that she loves you. She wants to come home." I thought about how to answer that for a moment. Does she know whose home she'd be coming back to? Carol went quiet. "The deed has one name on it," I said. "I'm asking whether she knows that." There was a longer pause. Carol said she would pass that along. She called back that afternoon, and in the way she said my name this time, softer, more careful, I understood that the answer had not been good. She said that's not the point. I thanked Carol for calling. I meant it. Carol was not part of this in any way I could be angry about, and I wasn't. The point, from Sarah's perspective, was that we were married, that I had left without explanation, that my silence was punishment, and that eventually, as I always had, I would recognize that sustaining a marriage required compromise. I had come to understand, across 11 years with Theo and 7 with Sarah, that certain people experience someone else's patience as an invitation to keep going. Theo had been messaging me since the night of the party. I hadn't responded to any of it, but I'd screenshotted everything. Most of the messages were attempts at explanation that managed to describe the affair in detail while framing it as something that had happened to him. But there was one, sent at 1 in the morning, the night of the party, before he knew whether I'd said anything to Sarah, that read, "She told me you'd take some time and then work it out. She said you always do." I read that message approximately 20 times over the following weeks, not because I needed to read it 20 times to understand it, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't adding something to it that wasn't there. I wasn't. She had a narrative about my behavior before the party was over. She had scheduled my forgiveness in advance. She was not afraid. She was managing a timeline. I forwarded the screenshot to my lawyer. The formal document arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered through Sarah's lawyer to mine. She was claiming entitlement to a share of the marital property, specifically the house, on the basis of domestic contribution. The argument being that her presence, her labor, her support of the household and of my career had constituted material investment that the law should recognize. This was not an absurd argument. Depending on jurisdiction and how certain facts were presented, it had real traction. My lawyer said so directly, which I appreciated. She also said we had a response and pulled out the prenuptial agreement. Still, a legal process would cost money, time, and sustained attention. Sarah's lawyer would argue that agreement was signed under different assumptions, that the years of marriage had changed the equitable calculus, that a document signed before two people built a shared life together deserved scrutiny. These arguments existed in the world. A judge might find them interesting. I sat with my lawyer one afternoon and calculated what it would cost to simply settle Sarah out of a portion of the house's current value, to pay her to go. It would hurt, but it was survivable. The lawyer said this was a reasonable option. I almost said yes. I was quiet for long enough that my lawyer looked at me with something patient and professional in her expression, waiting. That evening I called Priya and described the calculation out loud, the same way I'd worked through project costs with her 100 times. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You'd be paying her for sleeping with Theo in your house. That's what the math says." I did not settle. I filed for divorce. My name was on the petition. The process moved at the pace processes move, which is to say slowly. And in the meantime, I lived in the furnished apartment and worked and ate food that was usually fine and occasionally terrible, and learned how to manage laundry again without it becoming a symbol of anything. What I had not anticipated was the silence from the mutual friend group. There were 9 or 10 people in that orbit, colleagues, neighbors, couples we'd socialized with for years. After I'd left, they became Sarah's by social gravity. I didn't blame them. I had said nothing publicly. Sarah had said things privately, and privately was enough. I heard secondhand through Priya that Sarah had told people I had disappeared without explanation after the party, that I had left her alone in our home without a word, had refused all contact, and that my silence was frightening and strange. Someone in the group, a former colleague of Sarah's who knew me loosely, had posted something on her personal account about how marriages ended when one person chose control through silence over conversation. It wasn't explicit, but people tagged me. Several people from the group sent messages asking if I was okay, which meant they weren't sure I was the okay one. I had not told anyone what I had seen. I had no public account of the night. Sarah had a complete narrative, and I had restraint, which looks identical to guilt from certain distances. My lawyer said to stay off social media. I did, but I was watching the story settle into shape around me, and for the first time since the parking lot outside the shopping center, I felt genuinely afraid that this would not resolve the way it deserved to. The mediator's office was on the 6th floor of a building downtown, the kind of place with neutral carpet and framed prints chosen specifically to offend no one. I arrived 8 minutes early. My lawyer was already there, 2 folders on the table in front of her, coffee she'd brought herself going cold at her elbow. Sarah's lawyer arrived next, then Sarah. She looked composed. She was wearing the watch I'd given her for our 3rd anniversary, a small automatic, nothing extravagant, something she'd pointed at in a store window once and I'd remembered. I noticed it the way you notice things you shouldn't still be tracking. She sat across the table and, after a moment, offered me a small, apologetic smile, the kind that says, "We're reasonable adults, and this doesn't have to be ugly." I looked at my lawyer's folders instead. The prenuptial agreement came out first, clean, signed, witnessed, dated 14 months before the wedding. My lawyer walked through the separate property clause without drama. The house was purchased in my name, its equity had grown in my name, and the agreement confirmed that marriage did not alter that structure. She placed the deed beside it. One name. Sarah's lawyer argued domestic contribution. Her client had left a part-time position to support the household. Her client's presence had freed the primary earner to grow his practice without the friction of shared domestic labor. These were real contributions deserving legal recognition. My lawyer set down the bank records. 6 years of household expenses, all drawn from my business account. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, maintenance, the estate sale bedspread, the string lights from the party. Sarah had contributed a rent equivalent for approximately 22 months early in the marriage, then stopped when I told her it wasn't necessary. That generosity was now documented in my favor because I had recorded it as such at the time, as my choice, my contribution, made voluntarily and unilaterally. The record said so clearly. Sarah's lawyer shifted. The career trajectory argument then, Sarah's departure from her position, had coincided with a period of significant income growth for my practice. The implication being that her domestic support had enabled that growth. My lawyer produced a declaration from Priya. Priya had documented the timeline of the practice's development. With the same organized precision, she applied to everything. The contract that had driven the largest income increase, a 3-year enterprise agreement with a regional healthcare network, had been signed 26 months before the wedding. The vesting schedule, the growth curve, the client expansion that followed, all of it was already in motion before Sarah moved into the house. Priya stated this as a matter of business record, which it was, because she had been there for all of it and kept notes on everything. The career contribution argument did not survive contact with those dates. I watched Sarah's lawyer set down his pen for a moment. Not dramatically, he just placed it on the table and looked at his notes, recalibrating. There was a recess. 15 minutes. My lawyer and I stepped into the corridor. She said we were in a strong position and to stay steady. I said I was fine. I stood near the window and looked at the building across the street and thought about Joel saying twice a week sometimes, and the green bedspread, and Theo's message at 1 in the morning telling me she'd said, "I always work it out." When we reconvened, my lawyer entered the screenshot record of Theo's messages. She read the relevant one aloud. Not theatrically, just evenly, the way you read a document into a record. She told me you'd take some time and then work it out. She said you always do. The mediator looked up from the page. Sarah looked at her lawyer. It was a brief look, the kind that contains an entire conversation. And what it contained was, "I did not tell you about this one." My lawyer explained the context. The message had been sent in the early hours of the morning following the incident that initiated this proceeding, before Sarah was aware that I had left the property. It reflected Sarah's stated expectation, communicated to a third party, that my response to discovering the affair would be temporary and ultimately manageable. It was not introduced to establish moral fault. It was introduced to establish state of mind, Specifically, that Sarah had assessed my likely behavior and found it non-threatening to her interests. The mediator read it again silently. What the message did in that room was collapse the framing Sarah's legal position had depended on. The domestic contribution argument, the abandonment framing, the suggestion that my departure had been erratic or destabilizing, all of it rested on a version of events in which my response was disproportionate to whatever had occurred. The message said something different. It said she had not expected my response because she had not believed I was capable of it. That belief, it turned out, was the only place her strategy had ever been vulnerable. 3 weeks earlier, I had sent private messages to 4 people in the mutual friend group. Not a post, not a public statement. 4 individual messages to the 4 I trusted to handle information carefully. I told them what I had seen. I attached Theo's message. I said I wasn't asking them to do anything with it and wasn't interested in a public version of events, but that I wanted them to have the truth before their understanding of the situation fully hardened. 2 of them told others, quietly, personally, in the way that actual information travels. The controlling silence narrative had been meeting private friction for weeks, in conversations I wasn't part of and couldn't observe. And by the time Sarah's former colleague had posted her carefully non-specific reflection on marriages and silence, enough people had already heard a different account that the post had generated more private skepticism than public agreement. It disappeared within a few days. I didn't ask anyone to report back to me about it. Priya mentioned it in passing, the way you mention something that resolved itself. I had not won a social media cycle. I had told the truth to 4 people who knew how to carry it. That was all it took. The mediation produced a settlement by late afternoon. Sarah received a sum equivalent to the 22 months of rent-equivalent contributions she had made early in the marriage, adjusted for current value, with a modest addition for the years of general domestic labor. It was fair. The figure was calculated rather than negotiated because the documentation didn't leave much room for negotiation. The house remained mine. The business remained mine. The divorce would be finalized through the standard process, which would take the time it took. Sarah did not scream or cry or make a speech. She signed where her lawyer indicated. She looked tired in a way that was different from the composed expression she had arrived with, and I recognized it as the specific tiredness of someone who has spent months sustaining a version of events that the documents have now declined to support. Before we left, she approached me in the corridor. Her lawyer was watching. My lawyer was watching. She stopped about 3 feet away and said, quietly, "You really aren't going to talk to me?" I looked at her. I thought about 6 years. I thought about the green bedspread and the 47 calls and the message she'd sent Theo before she even knew I was gone. "I talked to you for 6 years," I said. Then I turned back to my lawyer and we walked to the elevator. I don't know what she did after that. I don't know what happened with Theo. Whether they stayed together, whether the thing that had seemed worth the cost turned out to be worth it. I made a deliberate decision not to track it, and I've kept that decision. Carol called me one more time, about 2 weeks after the mediation. She wasn't calling on anyone's behalf. She said she was embarrassed and that she wanted me to know that. She said she didn't understand how Sarah had believed it would end differently. I said, "I don't think she ever thought I wouldn't come back." Carol said, "What do you do now?" I said, "I go home." I changed the locks the following Saturday. Legally now, with no procedural complication, I had confirmed the timing with my lawyer. It took 20 minutes. I used a basic deadbolt kit from the hardware store and watched a 4-minute video to refresh my memory on the installation. I did it myself because there was no reason not to. Renata came over that evening. Priya came too. We had dinner. Pasta I made from a recipe Renata had sent me 3 times over the years because I kept losing it. A bottle of wine Priya brought. And an extended, somewhat absurd conversation about a client situation that had nothing to do with any of this. It was not a celebration. It was dinner with people I trusted, which turned out to be what I'd needed for a long time and hadn't been getting. The mutual friend group reconfigured slowly. Some people drifted back. Some didn't. I let it sort itself out without engineering it in either direction. I stayed in the house. It had always been mine. I'd bought it at 29 with money I'd saved by not buying things I wanted, chosen the layout because I wanted a room for a home office, and paid the mortgage for 6 years without being late. The house knew this even when I'd briefly forgotten it. A few weeks after the locks were changed, I was in the kitchen in the morning, making coffee. The spare key was still on the counter. The plain ring, the key Sarah had set out for the friend who never arrived, the one I'd picked up and put back down the night I walked out of my own party. It had sat there through everything. I'd moved around it. I'd looked at it a few times without deciding what it meant. I picked it up. I put it in the drawer next to the one where I keep takeout menus and expired coupons and things I'm not ready to throw away. I closed the drawer, the coffee finished. I poured a cup and stood by the window for a while, looking at the backyard where the string lights had been, thinking about nothing in particular, and then thinking about what the day looked like. A client call at 9. A proposal Priya wanted me to review. Groceries at some point. Ordinary things, arranged in an ordinary sequence, in a house that was quiet in a way that still sometimes felt like absence and sometimes felt like something I didn't have a word for yet. Both things were allowed to be true. I was still figuring out the difference.